And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Welcome, one and all, to the Republic News Network. This is President Geiger, Republic for the United States of America. And Dan Hampel has an exciting lineup for us tonight. You're going to probably want to listen to this show more than once. So with that being said, Dan, would you like to open us up with an opening prayer?
Yes, I certainly would. Our Heavenly Father, we come to you in this evening to hear the truth, to speak the truth, and to see our country return to its roots of constitutional Republican government. Lord, if we don't try and if we don't do everything in our power to restore this republic and to bring the truth back to our nation, we are finished as a nation. Lord, we pray that you will continue to be with us and that you will guide our footsteps and that you will make this program a beacon for freedom and liberty in the United States of America. This we pray in Christ Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Dan. Bruce is going to tell you about Bruce J. Morgan and Claire Lopez. So, Dan?
Yes, tonight we have on our program two leading national security experts, and Bruce has been on our program before. I think a lot of people will remember Bruce from several programs on national security, but we have the honor of bringing Claire Lopez into our program for the first time. And Claire, you are really quite an exceptional lady. I hope that our listeners and our viewers will go to the Republic website and look at Claire's bio and her information. She is literally, she's been in the belly of the beast for a very long time, and she is a lady of the highest standards and the highest regard for the freedom and the liberty of our nation, and she's done everything in her power for many years to try to protect that freedom. So with that said, I would first, Bruce, I'd like you to say a few things about some of the projects you're working on, and then we'll turn it over to Claire.
We're working on several national security programs, foreign policy, as well as Chuck and I had talked about the border security problem we were on last time with. Currently, we're looking at, I guess we can talk about today about Afghanistan, we can talk about Syria, and we can talk about North Korea. Each of them have their own particular nuances in strategic planning and crisis readiness and crisis preparedness. So I think we can go from there, and we can get into the weeds, if you want, about the jungle kind of activity that go on in operations, and Claire can lay some foundation for that, and I can follow up.
I think that's great. And Claire, I know that really is your particular policy strength, let's say, and knowledge is the we'll say the Islamic issue. I won't use that improper term. Claire, would you give us a little bit of information on your background, and so that the listeners can understand that you really are the ultimate, probably, knowledge base in our country, one of a very small handful of people that really have good information available.
Well, I thank you so much for that bit over-the-top introduction. I appreciate it. I am currently the Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Center for Security Policy. We're a Washington, D.C. think tank, and as our name suggests, we do focus on issues related to national security. Began my career after grad school with 20 years undercover CIA. operations officer working the Russian target. Served all over the world and enjoyed learning new languages and all kinds of things. Did some federal contracting for a while. I also taught students, military intelligence students out of Fort Huachuca for a while, and also Special Forces students down at Fort Bragg. So along the way, have met some wonderful people and currently have the privilege of working with wonderful Frank Gaffney and his team at the center in Washington, D.C.
Okay, well, thank you. Somehow there is a bunch of background noise on the program right now. Is there a way we can cancel some of that background noise? I'm not sure where it's coming from, but it's pretty annoying. Is there something that's being broadcast in addition? Does somebody have a TV on or something?
Not from my end.
No, not
it's all the guests. Any guest that's not speaking will mute their phone. That should help.
Okay, we've got some bad background sound coming through, but we'll go ahead and continue with the broadcast, and we'll leave this up to Kelby to clean up the background noise, I guess, when he does the final edit. So, Bruce, would you give me a little bit of a background on that email that was sent out on the White House press article outlining the successes of the first 100 days of the Trump administration? Would you outline the important policy successes and explain their importance to average Americans?
Well, what we're seeing is a new sheriff in town for foreign policy. We saw what happened in Syria with the 59 cruise missiles. It was a definite statement, followed by the Mohab in Afghanistan. So we have a new doctrine. We call it the Trump doctrine. It's establishing a way to understand how to, not aggressively, but to make a positive statement about freedom and liberty for people around the world. It's a little different take than what we saw before with the previous administration. And as we take a step forward here, we're looking at it as a way to look at Korea here as a containment. As Kim was very overt with his actions and threats, it gave us a window to look at how to better contain the situation. And as you saw, President Trump had ordered the USS Vincent aircraft carrier and its support destroyers over there. And now we're putting in some THAAD missiles there to support their already Aegis system and Patriot system. So you're giving us a window, as I was saying, for Kim to contain him and make sure we're understanding the entire dynamics to support our allies in the region, as well as support ourselves with the long-range ballistic missiles.
Okay. Would you also talk a little bit about some of the domestic policy things that have been conducted over the last 100 days, including some of the really, really important executive orders that have been rescinded or passed?
Well, we've been working on the local national security problems, as you well understood, with our team on the ground here in the States to help support the ranchers and the farmers. There were problems that were entailing various sundry things that went across national security lines. We were concerned about our dams, our water supply. So he had enacted an executive order for the Clean Water Act, which helped straighten out certain of those problems we saw as a larger range national security problem. As we looked at the border security, we're looking at the creation of the border security plan. And as we're looking at General Kelly, who's head of the Department of Homeland Security, had an executive order to support the action on the ground, hiring more staff for the border teams. across the board. And those three things, I think, are essential for our national security, which I look at, aside from appointing a Supreme Court judge, which was terrific. So.
Right. Good choice. Claire, would you've been an outspoken critic of past policies that jeopardized our national security. You've stated publicly that the Obama administration, especially, but also the prior Bush administration, allowed Islamic influence, and I refer to them as radicals, but let's say Sharia law influence into positions of influence within their administrations. Would you your opinions about motivations for this obvious policy blunder?
Well, I think we need to look at the Muslim Brotherhood operational plan for the United States, which goes back to a time shortly after World War II, when it already had a presence in Europe. But then President Dwight D. Eisenhower, invited a delegation, including Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and the son-in-law, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyid Ramadan, to the Oval Office for a meeting and a photo op in 1953. So that's how far back this goes.
Wow.
The Brotherhood didn't really gain a foothold or begin to establish its front groups in the United States until the 1960s, when the Muslim Student Association was the first front group for the Brotherhood founded here. It's now on campuses, hundreds and hundreds of them all over North America, as well as high schools now, we understand, and even I've heard down into the middle school level. So we're not talking about just the last president or two. This goes way back. And part of the reason for the failure, I think, to take firm action against Muslim Brotherhood operations and presence here in the United States has been a failure to understand what they stand for. Even though they're very vocal about it, they are jihadis. They unabashedly and publicly and repeatedly tell us all that they fight jihad in order to establish a global caliphate under rule of Sharia, of Islamic law. Now, there's absolutely nothing radical or extremist about that whatsoever. It's straight up the middle. It's normative, ordinary, everyday Islam. And the failure, though, has been to accept that and to recognize that that is really what they mean when they say it over and over again. We need to listen to them. They really do mean that. And so from that point onwards in the 60s, they built their presence here in the United States. But it really took off, I'd say, under the administration of Bill Clinton in the 90s. And again, it wasn't that he wanted to do damage to the United States. Far from it. He simply didn't recognize what he was dealing with, had no idea. One good example of that is Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, who turned out to be a top operative for Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood both, now serving a lengthy term in federal prison. But there are photo ops with him and in the White House, in the Oval Office, with both the Bill Clinton and Al Gore administration, and then another photo of him standing next to President George W. Bush in the White House. So it's not that these presidents didn't, want to protect U.S. national security or they were careless about it. They just didn't know. The real damage, though, has come in the last 8 years under the Obama administration. And during that time, the Brotherhood really has gained a foothold, accelerated and expanded its presence here in the United States. There are literally now thousands of organizations, front groups, affiliates of the Brotherhood operating in all of our sectors of society, from academia to our courts and legal system, our faith communities, outreach activities, interfaith dialogue, local law enforcement, media, and, of course, the government and national security badly penetrated throughout the intelligence community. So this is where we are now. This is a full-fledged insurgency. And if the training that was so decisively cut off, certainly during the last 8 years, but it really goes beyond that, if the language scrub, the vocabulary scrub of our official language and documents and official discourse is not corrected, if the training is not provided on an expedited, urgent basis to throughout the federal government, this isn't going to get any better. It's going to get worse.
Well, and would you kind of explain to our listeners, because I know a lot of our listeners haven't bothered to study Islam or read the Quran, to understand what you mean by average Islam is very much part of this idea of a worldwide caliphate and living under Sharia law.
Well, certainly it is, and those things are to be found in Muslim Brotherhood documents, imagery on their logo, certainly their motto, which is Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our guide, the Quran is our constitution, jihad is our way, and dying in the way of Allah is our highest aspiration. That is the motto of the Muslim Brotherhood to this day. But where this doctrine comes from is straight out of the Islamic canon, meaning the documents, the Quran, the Sunnah, which comprises both the hadiths, which are sayings, collected sayings and actions of Muhammad, plus his biography, the Sirah. Those two things together make up the Sunnah. And then Sharia, the law. The law was fixed and codified by the 10th century. It's a couple centuries after Muhammad is said to have died in 632, but it was all codified. The Quran was codified. Everything else was set down, imprinted in stone, as it were. It is immutable. It cannot be changed. And Muslims the world over have followed it for all of these centuries, going on 14 centuries and counting at this point in time. This is something like the Ten Commandments are set in stone. Nobody expects you're going to change the Ten Commandments. They're in stone. They're fixed. So it is very much mainstream Islam to divide the world into two parts. One is called Dar al-Islam, that is the house of Islam, or the place where Sharia is the law, and the Dar al-Harb. Dar al-Harb means house of war, the place that must be conquered because it is not under Sharia. This is how Muslims look at the world, our place and the place that has to be conquered, either by force and or by stealth, by guile. The Muslim Brotherhood typically resorts to the stealthy approach, and its theoreticians like Sayyid Qutb, and currently its senior jurist, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's an Egyptian but lives in exile in Qatar, have outlined this gradualist approach, infiltration into a society, into a government, especially we're talking about places in the West, like us, like the United States. They're not terrorists. They don't do terrorism. They do infiltration, information operations, and eventually subversion. And that's what we're seeing going on in the United States, as I mentioned, in all those different sectors of our society, with the ultimate aim, and they're very patient. They'll go at this as many hundreds of years as they need to, but with the ultimate aim that eventually the United States will be Islamic, in other words, under Islamic law, as they intend the rest of the world to be, at which point it would be a global caliphate. The one we're seeing lose ground right now in the Middle East may or may not survive, but something will take its place. There's no question something will take its place, because this is the fundamental command of Islam, to conquer the world for Allah, build an Islamic state, and enforce Sharia.
Why do you think our leaders are so blind to that, Claire? I'm just, I can't imagine why, with the intelligence community and all the information that's available, why our leadership has been so blind to that in the past.
2 words: information dominance. The Brotherhood, they are very sophisticated. These are not a bunch of camel jockeys running around with towels on their heads. Get that image out of your heads, anyone who ever had it. Not that you guys do or did, but these are sophisticated university graduates with graduate-level degrees in Islamic studies, jurisprudence, Islamic law. They know what they're doing. They've also had direct intelligence, tradecraft training, and know how to conduct information operations. And so what they've done is infiltrate, as I said, all these different sectors, but certainly the U.S. government and the top levels of our national security apparatus. For example, there were top Muslim brothers actually serving in the U.S. government over the past years. For example, the Imam Muhammad Majid, who is the imam at something called the Adams Center. That's an acronym. ADAMS stands for All Dulles Area Muslim Society Center out near Dulles Airport in Northern Virginia. And previously, he served, I think, a 4-year term as the president of ISNA, Islamic Society of North America, the largest Muslim Brotherhood organization, front group for the Brotherhood in the United States. Well, he, Imam Majid, was invited into the U.S. government, where he served in the Department of Homeland Security with a security clearance, and worked on something called the Countering Violent Extremism Working Group to help the U.S. government decide on counterterrorism policy. How does that work? Muslim brother, a jihadi, is now working on providing advice to the U.S. government on counterterrorism policy. We wonder what is happening to us, why we lost 2 wars in a row, one in Afghanistan, one in Iraq. This is why. There were others like Majid. By the way, Majid appeared at the National Prayer Service this past January, the 21st, the day after the Inauguration Day, and he was at the prayer service at the National Cathedral, saying prayers in front of the new Trump administration. How does that work? He's a top Muslim brother in the United States. This is what I'm talking about, information dominance. If that's where your information is coming from, and others like him, the National Security Council would turn frequently to him and to the Adams Center for advice, for visits back and forth. When that's where your information is coming from, and then the advice coming, and this actually happened, we call it the Great Purge that occurred during the Obama administration, around 2011, 2012, when language like Islam, jihad, caliphate, that used to be, after 9/11, at least for a time, in usage in U.S. government communications and speech and documents, literally was purged from the lexicon, from the official vocabulary. It was not allowed to be used. And at the same time, training curricula, as well as the instructors who went with that, who were able to teach these subjects, were likewise purged. So we've had at least 8 years now when across the entire ranks of the U.S. government, CIA, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, Department of Justice, etc., have been cut off, and then all the way on down the chain of command to local law enforcement, cut off from any accurate, truthful training about the Islamic movement. That's what the Brotherhood calls itself, the Islamic movement, jihad insurgency in this country. That's how we got where we are.
That's amazing. Bruce, I'm sorry, I cut you off. You were trying to say something?
No, not at all. I was going to talk about the blind sheik. He just passed away. He was a major movement for the Brotherhood. He was convicted of sedition, and there's other things I could talk about, but Claire's bringing the ball right down home plate, so I just want to keep my mouth shut there for a second. But as Chuck and I were working on border security, we knew 15,000 were coming across the U.S. border with Spanish surnames. Those are Islamic people. So if you take that, and when we started working on this back in 2003, that's 180,000 people. We don't know where they're at in the United States that came across the border. They were Islamic people. And I would say they were part of this movement. The Islamic Brotherhood, as we know, was responsible for the assassination of Anwar Sadat. That was part of that whole makeup of how this went down back in 1980 and 1981. Now, my friend in Chicago is Professor Sharif Boussiani. He went to grammar school with Anwar. So when they had problems over there with Morsi the last time, he went over there to try to help negotiate some of these disparities, as we would call them, and they've come to a reasonable facsimile of what to do. When the army took over, then they had the election of 2 subsequent presidents. But what Claire is saying, it's so insidious, it's so bad. We call it a broken arrow situation, and how we've been misinformed and misguided, and how we're initially taking our account. Because what we're missing is aiding and abetting. That's not part of what's going on. If you look at what goes down when one of these incidents happen, you're not looking at those who are aiding and abetting. That would take into account a lot of these types of organizations and support that comes in with money, that comes in with arms, that comes in with IED making. This is all part and parcel to that whole dialogue Claire was talking about. Who's doing it? What are they doing? To what extent are they doing it? It's the first principle you go by when you do an investigation, whether you're in any organization. If you're in the CIA, the FBI, the DEA, those are all our friends. And when we're out there looking at what's going down, I'm going to talk pretty straightforward here. We got to look at who's doing it and how they're doing it and why they're doing it. If we're not doing that, then we're not doing our jobs. And they're not doing their jobs now because they're given the political correct side of it, and they can't do what they need to do because they're called on the rug for it and they lose their jobs. Now, as we look at, I'll go back to what Claire was talking, we saw 170 to 190 generals and admirals be displaced in the military. This is unheard of. We know some needed to be replaced because they're reducing the military support, and some of those jobs had to go, but to the amount and to the degree these professionals were taken out of their positions, that also happened in the company, the CIA. These people were cast aside and pushed out because this type of dialogue, this type of criteria for understanding what is needed for national security is pushed aside. And that's what galls me personally, and that's what's moving Claire to talk about it in the way she does. We each have our own way of talking about it, but we're basically talking about the same thing: the neglect, the discounting, and not understanding what really constitutes national security and how it's going to be handled to each individual case. And like I'm saying, aiding and abetting. That's part and parcel to any investigation. That's not being done to the degree it should be done. And it's not taken into account into the way we all would look at it in a normal fashion. So I'll turn it over to Claire, and she can take over from there.
Okay. One thing I wanted to find out from both you folks is, do you see any change in this lack of, I guess I would call lack of clear thinking with the new administration? Do you think they're going to continue to follow these policies and listen to these bad news experts that are part of the problem and treat them like they are somehow the solution?
Well, Claire again here. We're all very hopeful, that the new administration will take a different line. Part of what gives us pause is the length of time it's taking to staff out some of these departments. For instance, at the Department of Justice, which is so incredibly important if you're going to talk about renewing prosecution, investigations of material supporters of terrorism, like Hamas doing business as CAIR in the United States, that is CAIR, Council on American Islamic Relations. But until very recently, perhaps this week, or maybe it's not even yet, the new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who has been confirmed, was early on, had nobody else confirmed to be even his deputy. So he was stuck, has been stuck all these weeks, 100 days, with the department filled with holdovers from the prior administration. So we're all really hoping that the pace picks up in terms of staffing out these departments with the new leadership and people who do understand these things, and that then they begin to call back for training and briefings some of the experts who were pushed out earlier. But I'll give you a recent, very recent, and somewhat disappointing example, and we talked about how earlier instructors and curricula were purged from U.S. official government training programs. Well, just this past week, I mean, here we are. This is April the 27th, 2017, and just this past week, we had a very disappointing case in which the Pentagon has caved in to demands from CARE. Remember, CARE is Hamas, doing business as CARE in the United States, to initiate a formal review of anti-terror training provided by a veteran instructor named Patrick Dunleavy, former Deputy Inspector General for the New York State Department of Corrections, testified in front of Congress as an expert witness on the threat of Islamic indoctrination in the prison system, so a serious instructor. CARE complains to the Pentagon his training is offensive, and now the Pentagon is acceding to CARE's demands and going to institute an investigation of his training, and worse yet, the individual assigned to be in charge of the review process, a Muslim Air Force chaplain who received his training from a Muslim Brotherhood-linked institution in Northern Virginia.
Wow.
So that's just this week. So we're really hoping that things will turn around soon.
I concur with.
We've got to, and we don't have any option if we want to survive as a country. We're gonna take a short break here, but we will be right back. And Claire, that was a great segue into the other things. So
my daughter asked me a very important question. She said, "Dad, why do you work so hard on this republic?" And I answered her, "Well, baby, the republic as given by our founding fathers is the most important form of government ever given to man." She said, "Dad, why don't you let somebody else do it?" I said, "Well, sweetheart, most of America thinks things are okay. And so long as their lives are not upset, they don't have to care about the important things that are taking place in their own country. Your dad likes to do things. I just don't want to sit and wait for somebody else. And if we didn't have our founding fathers, we wouldn't have this country. They were doers. They wanted something great for their children and grandchildren. And sweetheart, so do I." Ladies and gentlemen, I wish I could say that that's what happens in almost every home of our country, but it's not. Just 8 years ago, as a man who watched an $800 billion bailout given to banks when that money could have paid off every home in foreclosure in this country, which would have resulted in the banks getting the money anyway, I realized that we had a problem. And I stood up and I did something about it. I'm asking you to do something about it. I'm asking you to not just listen to these phone calls. I'm asking you to go to republicfortheunitedstates.org and read the Declaration of Sovereign Intent. Understand what we have done over the last 8 years. Understand what our intention is, what we are desiring to do for the people of this nation, and do something about it. Participate in the phone calls. Participate in building your states. Participate in finding a governor, finding a leader, finding the body politic of people that are going to stand up and build the de jure state. This is what we need. We need you to do something about it. We need you to be doers. Wednesday night of every week, we have a Building the States phone call at 6 p.m. Pacific. We encourage you to get on this phone call and understand how you too can be a doer. Thank you. I yield.
Well, Claire and Bruce, I'd like to continue on with the thought that Claire you brought into this, and that is that there's still a lot of issues, and there's a lot of money and a lot of influence being brought to bear against the Trump administration, trying to stop them from making the changes that will be necessary to bring our country back to a government of, by, and for the people. I guess I'll ask Bruce if you want to start talking about what you see as some of the problems that they've got now in D.C. with the power, money, and influence. It's being focused against the Trump administration.
Yes, sir. What we're looking at is mid-level appointees, like Claire was saying, as well as people who are going to be the deputies and the undersecretaries. From what Chuck and I are seeing and what Claire is seeing is you have to have an executive order followed through. He can write 50 executive orders, but if there's no follow-through, when I'm talking about strategical and tactical operations and making sure it's being executed on the ground according to, and you also need feedback. There's no way to check if there's feedback of what you're saying in the executive order is being carried through at the mid-level and then down to operations on the ground. And we're finding that to be true, too. So what Claire is saying, at the levels of government, it's taking place all throughout the federal government because in the Department of, EPA, the Bureau of Land Management, it's under Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture. You need people in place. Department of Commerce, where we're protecting our property rights, where we're protecting our intellectual rights. Those all need to be protected. Those are going right out the door at mid-level. Those are going right out the door at the operational level because if we're being cybersecurity attacked, that information goes right to those countries, right to those nefarious actors and players or into these countries' coffers to use our technology from the property rights, from the intellectual property rights that are being filed every day by normal American companies that do the normal process, and yet it's being usurped in those fashions. So people have to be in place in all the sectors, cybersecurity from top to bottom in every department and agency, so they protect them. And that's what I can lend to that because I've been working on that myself with our team. I work with like 4 or 5 different teams, and part of our group is working on that. And it's mind-boggling to what exposure we have and what risks are taking place. So they're having a special committee at the White House. I think Rudy Giuliani is going to be handling that if it's not already convened, and they're talking about these particular issues in this sector there. So just cybersecurity in and of itself and the amount of information that's being passed around between the corporations, the private sector, the government, and the people that need it in the government itself, it's being exploited, and it's at risk. And it's always, and as we saw at the end of 2016, the CIA tools for this were given up. And we haven't found the person in the CIA who gave it up. That was part of my anger at the time and trying to find out, because that happened at the same time we were looking at other cybersecurity risk. We knew in 2015 that the code was given out for all the manuals for nefarious state players, and so we had 2 things happen simultaneously. The RCS code was given out, the manual and the operations, and that was happening at the same time the CIA was compromised. So we had no idea what was going on anywhere in our government and who was exposed. So that's my understanding. So if we're looking at just a cybersecurity point of view and a mid-level point of view and who needs to be in place and undersecretaries and people in the National Security Council that need to get a handle on this to talk about what the misinformation is and to identify it and to make sure it's changed accordingly so everybody's educated properly and fittingly. That's what I'm talking about. I think Claire's saying the same thing, but we look at it just a little differently because we work on different things, but it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think you're right. Claire, what I wanted to visit with you about is to find out what your contacts within the various agencies tell you about the attempts to stop the president's America First anti-globalist policies. And we've got a bunch of well-placed agency insiders who are doing that. Who are these people, and why do they want to destroy the America as we know it?
Well, I can't say that I actually have any contacts inside the U.S. government, intelligence community, or any place else. We've, at the center, not been in contact with the Trump team, either before or after the election. We'd like to be. We'd like to be able to do some more briefings. But in terms of the holdovers, prior administration, people still in those positions across the government, certainly in the national security arena, their agenda, of course, would be very different than that of the incoming new President Trump. Now, of course, they're federal civil servants. You don't just fire them, but neither do they necessarily agree with the agenda of the new incoming administration. Now, of course, the honorable thing to do, if that's the case, that you cannot serve, you feel incapable of supporting the new president and his or her policies, then it's your obligation to go someplace else. But of course, they're not doing that. And but I would point in particular what we're seeing in these just first few months in terms of opposition to the president is coming from very liberal, lefty, anti-constitutional judges. Judges are the ones who are throwing up the roadblocks in terms of blocking some of the president's executive orders. For instance, on bringing in any more refugees from war-torn areas of the Middle East, at least until we can get a grip on our refugee resettlement and immigration systems, programs, which are in complete disarray right now. But a judge blocked that. So it does highlight the real importance of appointing good judges to these various circuit courts and to the federal bench.
Yeah, that's true, and we have been seeing a lot of that in the media, where many of these judges are declaring some of his executive orders to be unconstitutional, when in fact their decisions are unconstitutional, because all the president's trying to do is create a situation where we honor the law and we honor what's under our Constitution.
Well, and what some of these judges are trying to do is to make the U.S. Constitution apply to foreign nationals who have absolutely no rights and no access to the
legal
U.S.
status.
Legal system,
right.
No legal status. And they want to make the Constitution somehow apply to them, although I will say that it is already in U.S. law that the president has the right to exclude any person or group of persons at any time deemed by the president to pose a national security threat to the United States. That's already U.S. law. Never mind even the Constitution, although, of course, laws are derived from the Constitution. But this one goes back quite a number of decades, and he already has the authority and all he needs in law to exclude anyone he deems to be a threat to national security.
So we're looking at the 9th District as being the first group, and they're very liberal. They've been overturned 80% of the time by the Supreme Court. That's what we're talking about. And how we're looking at the effectiveness of what's being done. They're obstructing President Trump from executing his order. I'd like to talk about the countries he selected. And we know that this operationally part of ISIS territory in Al-Qaeda. As we saw, these particular countries, and we'll look at Syria and Iraq, the Caliphate state, we know that over 100 countries where these terrorists were coming from into these two countries to fight for the Caliphate. Now, if we're looking at that and we're trying to understand what happened, then there was displacement of people, and those people became homeless, destitute, and they went to the southern borders of Jordan and Turkey. And this has been the worst refugee crisis since World War II. It was up to 9 million people at some point. Those refugees then went to Europe. And from what I'm talking about here is that ISIS has infiltrated this group of people. And now we see the repercussions from that. Now I want to get back to my original premise. We see people coming in from 100 countries, and these people want to go back home. In Raqqa, they have a chemical and bomb-making factory. They're giving them all this information to take back to their countries. If we're talking about protecting the U.S. borders, and these people are going back to 100 countries around the world, how are we going to have an understanding of protecting our borders if we don't even try to contain it in these 6 countries? It's almost it's mind-boggling to me from a national security point of view that we're allowing this to go on, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense, and I agree. One of the things that's been coming out in the last couple of weeks is this information about Brennan and Rice wiretapping of Donald Trump and his campaign advisors. And that information is so important because it also means that they've had the access, as it turns out, to do the same thing to many honest Americans that have absolutely no reason to be listened to or wiretapped. Can either of you talk about that? Because that's a really important issue, and I know it gets a little bit off the conversation about the Islamic State, but it is important because it shows the level of deceit that's been really manipulated against the Trump administration by the prior administration.
Well, sure, I'll take a crack at that. Part of the problem in understanding what's been going on is inaccurate use of terminology. For example, in certain tweets, for example. Here is what happens. There is something called the FISA Court, FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and the court that is created from that. And when a U.S. national security agency, like let's say the National Security Agency, NSA, or the FBI perhaps, wants to monitor a foreigner, for instance, the diplomatic corps of the Russian delegation. That's a perfectly legitimate target to be monitored. And so what happens is that the FISA court will grant, upon request, mostly they grant the requests, to one of these agencies to they don't wiretap anymore. That's again inaccurate language.
Right,
but,
right. I understand.
Surveillance monitoring of their communications, of which now there's so many different kinds: telephone and tweet and cell and everything else. But what happens is that upon occasion, an American citizen will be picked up in the course of that monitoring in communication with one of those diplomats. And this is what happened, for example, with General Mike Flynn before he was named and began his short tenure as National Security Advisor. And even though the American citizen may be perfectly authorized to speak to a foreign diplomat like an ambassador from Russia, that American may be picked up in the course of the monitoring. Now, what happens, is supposed to happen, I should say, is that when those discussions, let's say telephone discussions, are assessed and analyzed by the agency, let's say it's the NSA or FBI, the identity of the American incidentally picked up in the course of monitoring the Russian, that identity is supposed to be masked, as they say. And so if there's a transcript, let's say, of the conversation, it would read something like, Ambassador Kislyak spoke to American number 1, and then he had a discussion with American citizen number 2, and it goes like that. Well, what happened apparently in the time leading up to the election and in the period between the election and January 20th Inauguration Day is that certain senior officials of the Obama administration, we now know National Security Advisor Susan Rice, made repeated, apparently dozens upon dozens of requests that the identities of Americans, number 1, number 2, be unmasked. Now that request goes back to the collecting agency, the NSA or maybe the CIA, and they're the ones who do the unmasking if they accede to the request. And apparently this happened over and over and over again, and that CIA director John Brennan was at least one of those senior officials who actually did the unmasking at the request of Susan Rice, and obviously she, working in and for the White House, the authority and the request must go to the Oval Office, to the president. So that was improper use, therefore, of a proper collection mechanism, the FISA court and foreign intelligence collection effort, but improperly used, improperly exploited for the purpose of political advantage. That's where the problem is. That's what's wrong, and that's what needs to be investigated.
Good. Extremely well articulated. Thanks, Claire. Bruce, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
We were working on part of that ourselves, but as I was saying earlier, at the end of 2016, President Obama issued an executive order which disseminated the information to the 13 different departments and agencies that do this kind of work. So if you're trying to do a Inspector General or a Attorney General investigation of how to find out where the information is coming from, you have to go back to the source agency. So if it's dealt across the board and everybody's getting the information, they're trying to cover the tracks of where the information initially came from, or there are going to be so much camouflage that it's going to take forever to find out how this all came about and what it entailed. So what I'm suggesting here is that if there's more to this, and I can't talk about all of it that we've been working with, but just the executive order itself by President Obama and what Claire was talking about with Susan Rice and possibly John Brennan, head of the CIA, we have innumerable possibilities of what happened, what went down, and who was doing what. And it appears to be for political purposes. And then if you throw the Russians on top of that, was it really a Russian involvement? Well, there's a whole dynamic, and I was talking about that earlier, with the code being released in 2015, and then with the CIA tools for doing the operations, the tradecraft, that was exposed. So we really don't know to what degree there was a lot of sabotage coming in with the Trump administration to find out what really went down. That's what I'm saying. How do you find out if everything you're given is given a big gloss over, and you got the normal investigative procedure is becoming a larger phase of how you're going to use more investigators, more taxpayers' money, more time spent to really find out who did what, when, where, to why, and to what extent. And that may answer a question that maybe some of the American public has in mind, that we take into account when we're looking at a national security problem, how it goes to a larger extent to a strategic, larger, huge, enormous problem that it's what we call broken arrow, and how do you address it? And Claire's talking about it through the Muslim Brotherhood. We're talking about it through internal problems with the investigative process itself. So you got two converging big problems that President Trump has to deal with. I think he's doing a great job. It's so hard to find where it's coming from if you don't have the people in place at the secretary level, what Claire is talking about, you know, the undersecretaries, the deputies, and mid-level. And if you're getting pushback there, that's what we're talking about. It's going to take a long time, if ever you're going to find out.
I just wanted to say that you just made some really good points, and I wanted to go back to something, which is that executive order of President Obama in some of the last months of his administration, in which he authorized for the first time that the transcripts of collected conversations would be dispersed throughout the entire intelligence community to all 17 of the member agencies. Not only did that disperse the information far wider than a group of people that have a need to know that, but it opened up the possibility of a whole lot more people who might be in a position to be tempted to leak the information. The breaking of the law that we're looking at here, misuse of FISA procedures may or may not be breaking the law. It's certainly not warranted, not justified. But the breaking of the law part came when whomever it was, in whichever agency or agencies it was, who then leaked names of U.S. citizens like General Flynn to the media, where it was then printed. It's not the journalist's fault. It is the person or persons within the U.S. intelligence community who leaked that information. Those are felonies, and that has to be uncovered. That has to be investigated.
I totally agree, but I want to add also we have SOG operators over covert operations going on, and some of that could be dovetailed into what Claire is saying. And boy, do we have a bad problem there, because we don't know who is being compromised, to what degree, what their families are being asked to do, and how that is going down. That's where I was looking at, Claire. So, yeah, I mean, we have, when you're doing an unmasking, some of it's coming in from covert operations, some of it's coming in from SOG operations, and then we have people in those networks that are informants that can be compromised out in a foreign country, or their families, or we can have our own people in those countries being compromised. That's what I was really, I'll say, ticked off about, because it goes to a larger degree to national security, and our people put their lives on the line in covert operations and SOG, and we don't know what happened to whom and what degree and where it's going down. That's what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I think has come out of this whole conversation is that President Trump is absolutely correct in his analogy of draining the swamp inside the Beltway. And I'd like both of you to maybe give our listeners an understanding of just how much that swamp needs to be drained and why.
The president has a office, and they do the hiring, and they probably need to pump that up, add more people into it to get the amount of people Claire and I are talking about. Just at the administrative level, you're looking at probably 2 years to hire as many as 10 to 20,000 people that you need. So and this is not replacing people Claire was talking about, should move out because they're part of a different philosophy, part of a different administration, and have a different agenda. That's a whole other group of people. But just to get the people he needs in there to carry out his executive orders, both on the strategic side and the operational side and the tactical side on the ground, to get the proper information back to make sure they're being executed correctly, that takes a while. And so far there's been obstruction. And like I'm saying, it needs to be done at the White House Executive Hiring Office. So there's one area I think needs to be addressed.
Okay, Claire, do you have any input on that?
Well, I totally agree, of course. And this is a difficult process, especially when you're talking about federal civil servants. Now, the option might be to use the budget process to downsize any particular department, which is no longer necessary, or possibly offer some kind of a transfer. I'll give you one example of a transfer that was not particularly helpful. Instead of offering people a transfer, to something like the Papua New Guinea desk, no offense to Papua New Guineans, by the way, but the point being that we've got, for instance, an individual who is connected to groups working with and for the Iranian regime, and she, Sahra Nuruzadeh, works inside of the State Department. Now, previously, she was working for NIAC, National Iranian American Council, which is the overt lobbying arm of the Mullah's Tehran regime in Washington, D.C. She was an intern there. Then she went to work under the Obama administration at the National Security Council, working on Iran matters and helping to get this disastrous nuclear deal done with Iran. Then she was moved to the State Department, where she was on the policy planning staff. And when complaints were made about that, she was simply moved over to an Iran desk job. Now, that is not an effective way of moving people from positions where they should not be and into positions where they can do less harm, let's say. And so there's a lot of that kind of thing that has to be given thought, but you first have to understand, I guess, what your policies are and what are the agenda items that you want to get through. If the agenda item, for example, of this new administration is ditch the Iran deal, which is a disastrous deal, a farce from beginning to end, then you need to move the people responsible for implementing that deal, for getting that deal passed, out of those jobs that they're in. But you got to have the policy first before you know whom to move and where to move them to. And that just doesn't seem to be happening yet.
I agree. Well, I hate to say this, but we've reached the end of our program, and I wish to thank both of you for being our guests and hope that you will consider returning in the future to be on another program. Claire, I thank you. You're obviously a terrifically gifted person, and you've got a lot of information, and I hope that you will consider coming back. And Bruce, as always, I appreciate your insight and your tremendous abilities in the national security areas. And I want to thank our listeners for tuning in to the Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel weekly radio program. And I ask that you return next week and join us for another program. And we will promise you we will have another group of guests that will be very informative, and we will give you information that you won't get anywhere else. So Bruce and Claire, thank you again, and good night to our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Dan Happel, for your continued vigilance in producing these Connect the Dots programs. It's been a blessing to all of America. And, of course, our battle cry in the Republic is liberty and justice for all. And I'm sure Bruce and Claire will be hearing from them again. It's been a wonderful show. So God bless you all, and you all have a wonderful rest of the evening and a good week.
He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is lifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be